neither as a gentleman nor as a parent. General Tilney as a how not to father. There's a theme in Northanger Abbey around parenting. It's not overt, it's not explicit, but it's there deeply embedded in the structure of the work. And Austen shows us 4 different models of parenting. The Morlands, the Allens, Mrs. Thorpe, and General Tilney. Now, when I started working on this, it occurred to me that part of the background to Austen's famously deficient fathers might have been that the nation itself was to an extent fatherless. Austen had, of course, begun to draft the work long before the Regency, but King George III had in practice been a non-functioning father of his country for many years, at least 20 years by the time she came to redraft the work. And as for the Prince Regent, well, he was hardly a father figure either. He was more a persistently Peter Pan kind of figure. And so I thought, well, other people must have examined this theme, but I couldn't find very much. I did find this article by Stuart Semmel, Radicals, Loyalists and the Royal Jubilee of 1809. And he wrote, in passing, in historical retrospect, the King's Jubilee of 1809 cannot but seem a poignant final blow for an elderly monarch who, as events transpired, would very soon retire into the shades of mental illness and his son's regency. So if we look at our very first parenting model, it's the Morlands. On Catherine's preparing to leave for Bath with the Allens, we read, everything indeed relative to this important journey was done on the part of the Morlands, with a degree of moderation and composure which seemed rather consistent with the common feelings of common life than with the refined susceptibilities, the tender emotions which the first separation of a heroine from her family ought always to excite. Her father, instead of giving her an unlimited order on his banker, or even putting an £100 bank bill into her hands, gave her only 10 guineas and promised her more when she wanted it. Only 10 guineas? This was actually half a year's wages for a working man at the time, and so it was a very generous provision, bearing in mind that it's basically pocket money for Catherine. The main costs of the journey and accommodation will, of course, be borne by the Allens. And if we think later on to when Catherine's on the point of leaving Northanger Abbey and Eleanor checks whether she has any money, she hasn't. She's spent it all. So Catherine may not have been provisioned like an heroine, but she could certainly spend like one. Then there are the Allens. Now, they don't have any children of their own, but they are in loco parentis for Catherine. Results are mixed, as are the messages. Mrs. Allen is relaxed about letting Catherine go out in an open carriage with the Thorpes, but Mr. Allen is not. Young men and women driving about the country in open carriages, now and then it is very well, but going to inns and public places together, it is not right. And then Mrs. Allen changes her mind. Yes, my dear, a very odd appearance indeed. I cannot bear to see it. Dear madam, cried Catherine, then why did you not tell me so before? Then we have Mrs. Thorpe, and she turns out not to be a good judge either. We see that Mr. Allen's expressed doubts about Mrs. Thorpe's parenting. And then there's the silly secrecy about Isabella Thorpe's engagement with James Morland. Mrs. Thorpe and her son, who were acquainted with everything, were allowed to join the girls' councils and add their quota of significant looks and mysterious expressions to fill up the measure of curiosity to be raised in the unprivileged younger Thorpe sisters. To Catherine's simple feelings, this odd sort of reserve seemed neither kindly meant nor consistently supported. And finally, our last parent is General Tilney. Now, at first, he seems the model of civility and kindness to Catherine. He's very flattering. Catherine is most politely received at Milsom Street. But in spite of General Tilney's great civilities to her, in spite of his thanks, invitations and compliments, it had been a release to get away from him. Catherine is perplexed by this. How can it be a relief to be out of the General's presence when he seems so well disposed towards her? In the meantime, the Morlands demonstrate their practical kindness as parents. As Catherine had said to Isabella, it is impossible for parents to be more kind or more desirous of their children's happiness. A living of which Mr. Morland was himself patron and incumbent of about £400 yearly value was to be resigned to his son as soon as he should be old enough to take it. No trifling deduction from the family income, no niggardly assignment to one of 10 children. An estate of at least equal value, moreover, was assured as his future inheritance. Now we know from Brenda Cox's work that the Reverend George Austen, Jane's father, earned about £900 a year for his 2 livings. So this shows how generous the Morlands' provision is. But the Thorpes don't see it that way. Mrs. Thorpe says, "Mr. Morland has behaved so very handsome, you know. I always heard he was a most excellent man. And you know, my dear, we're not to suppose, but what if you had had a suitable fortune? He would have come down with something more, for I'm sure he must be a most liberal-minded man." For her part, Isabella adds, "Nobody can think better of Mr. Morland than I do, I'm sure. But everybody has their failing, you know, and everybody has a right to do what they like with their own money." So Mrs. Thorpe is shown to be as poor and mean-spirited a judge as her daughter, which is saying something. Back to General Tilney and the journey to Northanger Abbey. Catherine notices that he seemed always a check upon his children's spirits. He was angry and impatient with the waiters at the roadside inns, so that Catherine came to dread disobliging the General by any delay. Austen shows us the General's way of interacting with Catherine. She shows it through indirect discourse, among other things. He was enchanted by her approbation of his taste, confessed the table setting to be neat and simple, thought it right to encourage the manufacture of his country. So it's as if he's saying this old thing, but getting brownie points for supporting local industry as well. He turned away, and Catherine was shocked to find how much her spirits were relieved by the separation. Yet again, Catherine can't quite understand why she is relieved when he leaves them alone. Now, when Catherine learns from Henry Tilney how foolish and very unreasonable her imaginings about Mrs. Tilney had been, she's quite overcome with embarrassment. But at the same time, she realised she was right in her aversion to the General. Catherine's intuitions are sometimes very sound, and she's inherited principles as well as sound judgment from her parents. So, after reflecting on the whole thing, upon this conviction, she need not fear to acknowledge some actual specks in the character of their father, who, though cleared from the grossly injurious suspicions which she must ever blush to have entertained, she did believe, upon serious consideration, to be not perfectly amiable. So she'd been right about him, but for the wrong reasons. And of course, the General goes on to confirm this in dispatching her so rudely, using Eleanor as a proxy, from the Abbey. The manner in which it was done, so grossly uncivil, hurrying her away without any reference to her own convenience, or allowing her even the appearance of choice as to the time or mode of her travelling, at almost the earliest hour, as if resolved to have her gone before he was stirring in the morning, that he might not be obliged even to see her. What could all this mean but an intentional affront? And so Eleanor steps up. She is now in loco parentis. In checking whether Catherine has any money for the journey and supplying it as a loan, Eleanor acts as the parent where the General has failed. And in fact, money turns out to be key to Catherine's successful journey home. Her youth, civil manners and liberal pay procured her all the attention that a traveller like herself could require, and stopping only to change horses, she travelled on for about 11 hours without accident or alarm, and between 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening found herself entering Fullerton. Mr. and Mrs. Morland could not but feel that the journey might have been productive of much unpleasantness to Catherine, that it was what they could never have voluntarily suffered, and that in forcing her on such a measure, General Tilney had acted neither honourably or feelingly, neither as a gentleman nor as a parent. Why he had done it did not oppress them by any means so long, and after a due course of useless conjecture that it was a strange business and that he must be a very strange man, grew enough for all their indignation and wonder. "My dear Sarah, you give yourself a great deal of needless trouble," said her mother at last. "Depend upon it, it is something not at all worth understanding." The wisdom of Mrs. Morland, the motives of others are always more or less opaque to us. When Henry arrives at Fullerton, he did not address himself to an uncandid judge or a resentful heart. Far from comprehending him or his sister in their father's misconduct, Mrs. Morland had always been kindly disposed towards each, and instantly, pleased by his appearance, received him with the simple professions of unaffected benevolence, thanking him for such an attention to her daughter, assuring him that the friends of her children were always welcome there, and entreating him to say not another word of the past. Having wondered and corrected Catherine's mistakes about his father, Henry is now in the uncomfortable position of having to admit that the General has in fact behaved cruelly and unnaturally. The Morlands' tempers were mild, but their principles were steady, and while his parents so expressly forbade the connection, they could not allow themselves to encourage it. But whenever Catherine received a letter, as at that time happened pretty often, they always looked another way. And finally, it is Eleanor's elevation to a title which finally softens the General enough for him to give an offhand permission for Henry to marry. And as this took place within a 12-month after from the first day of their meeting, it will not appear, after all the dreadful delays occasioned by the General's cruelty, that they were essentially hurt by it. I leave it to be settled by whomsoever it may concern whether the tendency of this work be altogether to recommend parental tyranny or reward filial disobedience. So thus, at the end, Austen has a final laugh at our expense, underlining my contention that parenting is one of the key themes of the book. The Morlands are perhaps the most likeable and admirable parents in Austen's works. Their goodness and their sense more than common are highlighted by the contrast with the very bad parent that is General Tilney. Thank you.